You're listening to the second season of the Study Podcast with Dr. Paul Wegner on Genesis. I'm your host, Tyler Sanders. I'm here with Dr. Paul Wegner, and he's going to tell us the Hebrew word of the day, which is a bit of a spoiler because it's also the subject of this podcast.
Well, it's one of the subjects.
One of the subjects.
Yeah, because there's so many in this one. Our Hebrew word of the day is Nephilim. Mm-hmm. And so it means, it's in Genesis 6:1, and it starts off, the Nephilim were in the world, or were in the land at that time. So that's how it starts, and so you've got to figure out, okay, what's going on here? So let me just read 6:4 so that you know, because I sometimes think we know, or we think we know what this passage says, but I think it's a surprise sometimes. So this one, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards, when the sons of God came to the daughters of men and they bore children to them. So notice it says that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. It doesn't say that they were the offspring. So I think most people just automatically think they're the offspring, but that's not what it says. Okay? And then those were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. I think that those is referring to the children that were born to them. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what's happening. These sons of God and daughters of men are having children, and those are what are called the mighty men, the men of old.
And
men
really,
of renown.
Nephilim, excuse me, Nephilim, what you're saying in this verse basically is that it's just kind of telling you when this is happening.
Yeah, and I'll try to explain why it would say that. So let's first try to figure out what the word means. And
that's good.
You know how we've always done this.
This is going to be a long Hebrew word of the day section, isn't it? This is part of the podcast.
Sorry. It occurs only 2 times, so you know that we always want to see where else
the
it
other
occurs.
Context,
So it's in Numbers chapter 13, verses 22 and 23. Okay, I did 32 so you'd get the context of what it was. So they gave the sons of Israel a bad report. Remember, they were spying out the land, of the land which they had spied out, saying, "The land through which we have gone." And spying it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people who we saw were men of great size. So that's a hint, all right? They were also there. We also saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, were part of the Nephilim, and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. So the hint is definitely suggests that these people are larger, and that we felt like grasshoppers in our sight. And there's one more hint when it says that the sons of Anak. In Hebrew, the word Anak means a neck, like our neck. So I'm assuming what that means is that they're a head and a neck taller than most people. So when it says the sons of Anak were part of the Nephilim, that would actually fit into that context really, really well. So the Anak were tall people, and these fit with them. So our context is already suggesting these guys are big and stuff like that. I put this picture in just so you know they're not rock people like the Noah's
so
movie.
this is an image from Noah, the movie Noah, which I think Ridley Scott's movie. And it's a monstrous.
The thing he got right probably is that how tall they are. All right. Okay. So now let's go back. So Nephilim. Notice I tried to highlight in white the roots. And I think it comes from the word to fall. And it could mean fallen ones or corrupt ones. And I think that would actually fit this. Or it could mean to fall on somebody. I doubt that it means they're just clumsy. So I'm pretty sure it's not that. But if they go around and fall on other people to beat them up or steal their stuff. I think that's what it's getting at. And then that would mean fallen ones, these are corrupt, so they're robbers or something like that. And I think that would make sense. So I think they fall on people to harm them, so they are mean people or robbers or something like that. And these people around were before the flood and after the flood. So it sounds like to me, if they're a kind of a people, not that they're a race of people, but they're more morally kind of people of a corrupt group, then it would make sense that they were before the flood and after the flood. So what that means is the flood didn't totally do away with these corrupt people, and that would make sense because we have a sin nature. The sin nature comes back. And I've always told my students, if I was really tall and I was really mean, why would I keep working if I've got little people around me that I could say, here, you do this, or you've got something I want, I'm just going to take it.
Yeah.
If you're a corrupt big person, why are you going to, not fall on other people and steal their stuff?
Right.
So I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's what it says. Now it came about when the men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them. Because remember, this is the context of Genesis 6 and where everything's coming from.
Yeah.
That the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. All right. I'll come back to that. But let's go to this. What I wanted to show is that in chapter 4, right ahead of this, and in chapter 5, right ahead of this, we've got two genealogies.
Okay.
The one is of Cain, and it goes down, gets to Lamech, and right at Lamech, remember Lamech was that one that says, and he killed somebody for harming him and wounding, and a boy for wounding him or something like that. So it makes it sound like he's really mean, and he's doing stuff he's not supposed to.
Yeah.
It doesn't. It's hard to know exactly what that's getting at. I can't tell if it's a boast or if it's talking about how mean he is. Yeah.
Right.
But then on Seth's line, right in the heart of that, you've got Enoch, this man that walks with God, and he was not, for God took him. So my understanding is that in this context, then we got the fifth genealogy, or the genealogy 5 for Seth. It talks about them having other sons and daughters, which suggests to me it's multiplying. And that is funny. It wasn't said in Cain's line that they had other sons and daughters. It just kind of goes through it. And then the second thing is they also, it says they lived a certain amount of years, then they had children, and then they lived a few, more years. So the idea is that they seem to have lived longer, even though it doesn't actually tell you that for sure. It's like suggests that anyway.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Then it goes into men began to multiply on the face of the earth. So it would make sense, especially after that genealogy in chapter 5, that it would then start talking like what it says in chapter 6.
Yeah.
So does that make sense? So what I'm trying to do is show that there's a flow in the passage itself that kind of suggests that this is building upon what came before.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay, so now we've got sons of God and daughters of men. There's going to be several views on that, so we'll come back to that.
Okay.
It says they took wives from themselves, from whomever they chose. You know that word for they took wives? That's the normal Hebrew word that means to get married. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Right.
As far as I can tell, they did it the normal way, marrying people.
Yeah.
Okay.
It doesn't have like some kind of implication of
stealing them or anything like that,
right.
as far as I could tell. But then the next one, whomever they chose, that might be the key. Because remember, we just got through Cain's genealogy, then Seth's genealogy, and now they're multiplying, and they're starting to take brides from whomever they chose, which suggests that the lines are starting to mix. And I think that's what's the key in this one, is what's going on. We've got Cain's line, which was the corrupt, we already know that Lamech was in it.
Right.
And then Enoch is in Seth's line. So it seems like to me we've already got a structure created that suggests we've got a problem here of these mixing together.
Yeah, specifically these two lines. Basically.
Yeah. And then now look at verse 3. Then the Lord said, my spirit will not strive with man forever because he is flesh. Nevertheless, his days will be 120 years. So it sounds like God's having to limit their length because of the corruption that's there. So I think it makes a lot of sense. Then the next verse says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. So it in this context, it sounds like, okay, it's so corrupt that God's having to limit their life, and the Nephilim are around at that time, beyond all that.
Yeah.
Okay? When the sons of God came to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Okay? They were the mighty men, the men of old, men of renown. But then look at verse 5. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and every intent of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. I've often told my students, I can't believe verse 5 is really, they've heaped up phrases to let you know just how bad it is.
Yeah.
It's about the worst you could say it.
Yeah.
Or to to let him know how bad it was.
Yeah.
And then verse 6, and the Lord was sorry that he made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So it seems like our context is suggesting we've got a problem here.
Yeah.
And let's see if we can fix it. All right, so here's the issues we've got. Chapter 6 basically is talking about how corrupt mankind is. So God decides to send the flood to destroy them, okay? But even in the judgment, God is gracious in that he saves Noah so that we've got people to continue afterwards. So there's several questions. Who are the sons of God and daughters of men? And these are our options. They're angels versus humans. That's been a long traditional one. Sethites versus Canaanites. That's the one I think it is. I think the genealogy suggests
that's the split,
Yeah. Rulers and commoners. That one, later on, you're going to see that rulers can also be corrupt, and they can take whomever they want and stuff like that. So it's possible, if I didn't go with Sethites and Canaanites, I probably would go with this one, that the rulers are more corrupt, and what's happening is they're taking whoever they want, and then now it's real corruption is on the earth. So that's possible. And then somebody has argued that's just a continuation from chapter 5. I don't really think that one makes much sense. It is a continuation from 5, but it's still telling us something's wrong and there's a corruption coming in. So I don't think that really, just that continuation doesn't, I think it's right. I just don't think it answers any of our questions.
Right.
So, okay, so what is their sin? Took wives from whoever they chose is what it sounds like. Men's days will be 120 years. That's another thing that we need to talk about. Who are the Nephilim? And we'll want to talk about that.
Yeah, of course.
And the wickedness was so great that God was sorry that he made man.
Yeah.
So let's get the easy one out of the way first.
Okay.
I think this idea of them coming together and now they're going to only live for 120 years. Some people have argued that it's a shortened lifespan, that God now limits their life to 120 years.
Yeah.
The problem with that is that there's no doubt that people start living shorter after the flood, but 120 years does not appear to be a normal lifespan.
Right.
Pre-flood, Shem lives 600 years. Post-flood, Terah lives 205. Okay, so that it's definitely reduced.
Yeah.
But I can't find many people that 120 years becomes like the standard.
Yeah.
So it doesn't seem to fit. So what I actually argue, it's 120 years to the flood. And I'll try to explain that. The flood is going to be where God punishes mankind and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So the problem is if you compare Genesis 5:32 with 7:6, it appears to be only 100 years before the flood. So because those passages in his 500 years, it talked about in chapter 5, but then in his 600 years, the flood comes.
Yeah.
So that's not 120 years either. So what's going on?
Yeah.
I'm going to argue that I think it's out of chronological order.
Okay.
And that chapter between chapter 5 and 6, you've got there's even I'm going to show you a place where I know it's out of chronological order.
Yeah.
And maybe what happened is they wanted to get that idea of the corruption and all that in to put it with the flood, so they left that in there.
Yeah.
Let me explain. In chapter 10, you've got talking about in Genesis 10:5, it says, and they were divided between the languages and the tribes and all that, and then But chapter 10 is actually before chapter 11, where the Tower of Babel explains the languages coming out. So it sounds like we have languages divided before we even have it in chapter 11.
Yeah.
And then verse 20 and 31 both say the same kind of thing, suggesting we have different languages before chapter 11.
Yeah.
So it seems like what's happening there is that the flood, the Tower of Babel probably happened sometime during the time of chapter 10.
Yeah.
But they didn't want to break it up, so they kept 10 together, which usually is called the Table of Nations.
Yeah.
So they keep that together and then have the thing that would have fit somewhere in there after it.
Like
so
the event kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if that's true, I don't see any problem with doing that with the flood too. They wanted to get that the reason for the flood and stuff like that, and so it could have happened earlier.
Yeah.
But it's it makes it look like it's 100 years rather than 110 years or 20 years.
120. Yeah.
Yeah. So does that make sense? So
I think so. Yeah.
There's other places that are probably out of chronological order, but these
Sure,
ones
yeah.
I think are real clear.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think that's a good example in
yeah.
10 and 11 for sure.
Yeah. So I think that then probably answers the 120 years.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, the sons of God and daughters of men. Now that's the harder one, I think. I made a chart so
Yeah,
you
we got
could see.
4 options here.
Yeah. So the fallen angels and mortals. Sons of God are the fallen angels, and the daughters of men are mortals. Offense was mixing of supernatural and mortal.
Okay.
Why don't we talk about that first?
Yeah.
Sons of God normally refer to angels. And you've got passages there that suggest that. And then in the New Testament, you've got Jude that seems to suggest that. Let's go to Jude. It's in chapter, remember it's only got one chapter.
Yeah.
I'm going to start at 5 so we get a context.
Yeah.
All right, so 5 says, now I desire to remind you, though you know all things once for all, that the Lord, after saving people out of the land of Egypt, subsequently destroyed those who did not believe, and angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode, he has kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of great day. Just as Sodom, Gomorrah, and the cities around them, since they in the same way as these indulged in gross immorality and went after strange flesh and exhibited an example of undergoing punishment of eternal fire.
Okay.
So if you put those together, it makes it sound like the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was the same sin that they had with the ones when talking about these them abandoning their proper abodes.
Yeah, they're where they're supposed to be.
Yeah. I'm actually arguing that instead of mixing them, you should see these as 2 examples.
Okay.
The first example is where the angels didn't stay in their own abode, and then the second one is Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah.
So it's talking about corrupt things that happened.
Yeah.
But I don't even think that we have to say that when the angels fell, there was a time that they fell, but that's not ever mentioned, I don't think, in the biblical text itself. I think the angels fell before creation ever started. So if this is talking about that time when the angels fell, and then the second one was in Sodom and Gomorrah.
Right.
So these are
two examples.
Yeah, 2 different corrupt times, but separated by a lot of years and not even the same exact kind of sin.
Yeah.
Okay?
Okay.
So I think and his example is the God punishing wickedness. Because he talked about them coming out of Egypt and destroying the wicked people.
Yeah.
So in context, having 2 other examples of that would make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So that's what I think that Jude 2 and 3. The First Peter passage, that one's a tough one too. But let me take you to that.
Yeah.
All right. So 1 Peter, chapter 3, and we're at verse 19 and 20. All right. I'll start at 18 again. For Christ also died once for all, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God, having put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. Okay, so it sounds like Jesus dies. So it's talking about, I think, the cross.
Yeah.
Jesus died, but then he was made alive in the spirit. So he really didn't die. He came back. Okay. In which he also went and made proclamation to the spirits now in prison, who once were disobedient when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah, during the construction of the ark, in which few, that is, 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. So I think what he's doing, I think this is the context is when Jesus died on the cross. There was something. I've always argued that what that is he goes down to a place called Hades. If you remember Luke 16 has Abraham's bosom on one side, and you've got the wicked on the other side. The rich man is on that side.
Oh, yeah.
And it's called Hades.
Yeah, the rich man and Lazarus story, right?
Right.
Yeah, the separation, but they can see each other.
Yeah. So my understanding is what happened is that when Jesus died on the cross, all those in Abraham's bosom could actually take off, because now he's made the way for them to now go to heaven. And that fits that passage where Jesus says to the man on the cross, today you'll be with me in paradise. So I think that's what he's talking about. I think that's new. I don't think they could have gone to paradise before Jesus dies on the cross. So I think that would have been something, and that helps confirm that when Jesus died, that's what happened.
Yeah.
Okay? So I think what Jesus does is he goes down to the other side when he dies and makes a proclamation to them that they are not going to leave and go to heaven
Right.
because they were wicked in this life.
Yeah.
Because it gave the example of the people like in Noah's day.
Yeah.
And remember, the people in Noah's day were all wicked and
Yeah.
stuff. So they're going to continue and stay in that place of Hades until the last days when they'll be cast into the lake of fire.
Right.
So I think that proclamation that he's making, and it's the same word that's used for the euangelion, the good news.
Yeah.
But in Peter, it never means the good news. It means a proclamation. So I think, because remember, if they could see what was, if Luke 16 is right, they can see what's going on. So when they saw him take off, they might have thought, oh, wait, good. One of these days we'll get out of this too. And I think he had to tell them, no, you've rejected me in this life. You're going to stay there.
Yeah.
So I think that's what that passage is talking about. And it talks about in the days of Noah, but I think it's for a different reason.
Right.
There's one more passage that they often go to, and that's 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4. And again, I think this you have to understand this way, the same way you understand Jude, multiple illustrations.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me start at verse 3. And in their greed, they will exploit you with false words. Their judgment from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. For if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to pits of darkness reserved for judgment. So that's the first illustration, and I understand that to have happened when when Satan rebelled against God and took some angels with him, that's that time before creation ever happened.
Yeah.
Then the second one, and he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others whom he brought the flood when he brought the flood of world on the ungodly. So once again, it's not meaning these are the same time periods. It's just saying it's a second example.
Yeah.
And then the third example is in verse 6. And if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction, reducing them to ashes, having made them an example to those who live ungodly lives thereafter. So I think what you've got there are 3 examples of different times when God punished the wicked in the world.
It's interesting to see this with Jude. This list of 3 makes it a little bit more clear, kind of like that it would be 3 separate.
I agree.
Instances.
I think this one is a little clearer than the Jude one, but
I
think
it's helpful that it's similar.
Yeah.
They both are referencing Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And even Noah, I think.
And Noah too. Yeah.
So, okay, so that's how I understand that. Now, what I do admit is that First Enoch 6 through 11, that does suggest that this is talking about sons of God and daughters of men, and that the sons of God are angels.
Yeah.
But I don't. Remember, it's apocryphal work, so I don't think. I think that's probably how some Jews understood it. I just not sure it's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Here's problems with that. Why would men be punished for something the angels did? See, the flood seems to be what God is sending on the earth. And if this is the sons of God and daughters of men, it's angels interacting with mankind.
Yeah.
So why, I'm assuming that an angel has more power than a normal human being. So I guess they could even force them to marry him or have sex with him. Well, if that's true, why would the mankind be punished for something the angels did?
Yeah.
So it just seems wrong to me.
Well, and in chapter 3, we see punishment for all the parties involved.
Yeah.
And it's specific.
Yeah.
And
it's because what they did.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then there's no evidence that angels can intermarry with humans. In fact, Jesus actually says that in heaven they don't intermarry. Remember, he was talking to the Sadducees, and he says, "Oh, you don't understand Scripture or the power of God." And he talks about it was that illustration where there's 7 men had one wife.
Oh,
and they all died.
Who are you married to in heaven, essentially? Right?
Yeah. And he says, "Well, you don't understand the Scriptures or the power of God."
Yeah.
So it seems like to me, and he actually even says their angels aren't like men on the earth. They don't give and take in marriage.
Yeah.
So it would seem like to me that now that's in heaven, and I understand that, and this is on earth, so it might be a little different.
There could be a change that happens.
Yeah. Okay, so that's that.
Okay,
view.
that's number one.
Yeah.
Number two.
Number two is the godly line versus ungodly line. So
Okay,
we
so
have
that's the Seth and
Sethites
Cain.
and Cain, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, the sons of God are the godly line of Seth. The daughters of men are the ungodly line of Cain. Offense was mixing of godly and ungodly lines.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that would actually fit that. And they took wives from whomever they chose. Remember that phrase?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that would fit that. Context suggests this if you're reading chapter 4 and then 5.
Yeah, you get these two genealogies.
Yeah, and then you
a
go into
description
6.
kind of. Yeah.
So that does make some sense.
Mm-hmm.
Noah is said to be alone to be holy, and thus Sethite appear to be corrupted by the Cainites.
Okay.
Or Canaanites. Or Cainites, sorry.
Canaanites, yeah.
So that actually does make some sense too. By that time, the intermixing was so strong that you hadn't very few righteous people at all.
Yeah.
Okay. Only men are punished in the flood, not angels. So that seems like to me, we've talked about that in the other views, but it seems like to me that makes sense now. The men are being punished because of what they did.
Right.
Okay. Problems with it. The term sons of God does not mean this in other places. Usually when it talks about sons of God, it's talking about angels. And, I admit that.
Yeah.
Now, this is the first time it ever occurs. And usually you read a passage in context. You read how words mean in context.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like to me, sons of God would have made sense right after the Sethite line.
Yeah.
So I think that makes sense anyway. And then no evidence that lines were totally separate. That they were separate, and then now they start mixing.
Yeah.
And I on that one, I don't know that it has to be a total mixing, even if it's enough that they're so wicked that there's very few righteous people.
Yeah.
That would be enough, I would think.
Okay.
And actually, we know that by the flood time, you've got an awful lot of corruption, and the only ones that are said to be righteous are Noah and his family.
That's true. Yeah.
So it seems like that's pretty good evidence. All right, then number 3.
Okay.
All right. Dynastic rulers and commoners. So the sons of God are the dynastic rulers. The daughters of men are the commoners. The offense was polygamy and uncontrolled power. So that them coming together and forcing them to have. So you've got places that refer to rulers or judges as gods. Now, when you look at those passages, I'm not convinced that they're right. That's why I don't go this route.
Okay.
We could actually
look
look
at
at one.
Exodus?
You want to look at one? Exodus 21:6. I feel more comfortable. I'm back in the Old Testament now. All right, here's what it's talking about. In 5 it says, but if the slave plainly says, I love my master and my wife and my children, and I do not want to go out as a free man, then his master shall take him to God, is what the literal Hebrew is. And he shall bring him to the doorpost or the door or the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl. That's like a pointed thing, and it's a tool used to make a hole or widen a hole.
Yeah.
And he shall serve him permanently. So it's talking about if a person wants to be an indentured servant and they can do it forever, and the person will own him, a slave can make that choice.
Yeah.
But it says to take him to Elohim. That's what it is. And some people have said that Elohim would be judges in that case. And it seems like to me it makes more sense that he takes them to God.
Yeah.
And here's why I say that. Notice it takes him to the doorpost, and it sounds like it's the doorpost of the temple. So it sounds like it's already in the context of a priest doing this in the temple. But I also think it's only God that can actually. I assume the reason for this is so that a person isn't forced to become an indentured servant forever.
Right.
That if you take him to God and the master is forcing him to do it, then God will be the one that punishes because God would know.
Yeah.
So I actually think it makes more sense to have this Elohim be God rather than the judges.
Yeah.
And all of them have that, except
a similar kind of thing.
Yeah, there is one. Can you go to Psalm 82?
Yeah.
That one is different. Okay, so Psalm 82 says, and God takes his stand in his own congregation. He judges in the midst of the rulers. So the context seemed to be God overarching where all the rulers are, and he's the sovereign of all them.
Yeah.
Now look at verse 6. I said, you are gods, and all of you are the sons of the Most High. Do you remember?
Wow.
Yeah. So it's using the word Elohim, and he even says sons of the Most High.
Yeah.
In the sense that my understanding is that God is over everyone. So in that sense, he is responsible for them, and they're his sons.
Yeah.
So that's how I understand that. So remember, they tried to get Jesus on this. Remember, Jesus said, they asked him, "Do you claim to be the Son of God?" And he says, "Well," and he quotes this psalm and says,
Yeah.
"Well, look, we're all sons of God."
Right.
And in that sense, I think we could say that they're all sons of God.
Yeah.
So I think I think that in that passage, you do have Elohim being used
Yeah.
as a somebody who's related to God and something like that,
Right.
his offspring.
But it does seem a fairly specific context.
And that one was pretty clear
Yeah.
that he's talking about his sovereignty over the world.
Yeah.
All right. So in the ancient Near East, kings were sometimes thought to be divine. Now,
Oh, sure.
you've got now pharaohs were only divine after they died. So,
Oh, really?
Yeah, it wasn't before they
interesting.
died. And then in other places, it's not as common as we might think. But there are some places that appear to have at least divine qualities, like Gilgamesh is thought to be half man and half God.
Yeah.
So you do have that kind of mixing.
Yeah.
So I can live with that.
Okay.
And then similar to Genesis 12, 10 through 20, remember, even the Pharaoh takes Sarah to be his wife.
Right.
But if you remember, it was because he thought she didn't have a husband. And once he finds out that she does, he kicks him out.
Yeah.
Remember? So it's not like he was usurping his authority to take her. So that's really not a good example.
Let's get to that in a future eepisode, actually.
Okay. All right. Okay. So here's
that's a fascinating set of stories.
Yeah. Okay. And then, so the problems with it is there's no clear reference to kingship or divine kingship, we'll say.
Yeah.
And then kings are not generally referred to as divinity in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
It does happen. It happens in other cultures, but usually not in the biblical text.
Yeah.
Okay?
Okay.
And then the last one, I'm not even sure that it's really a strong argument, so I don't even know if we have to worry about it. But they argue that the sons of God were men and the daughters of men were women.
Okay.
That's kind of like a given, so I'm not sure. And it also fits in with my godly line anyway. So we're the Sethites, and see, I don't understand. I didn't understand how this argument really worked. Because later God wants to punish mankind for the corruptness and all that. So I'm not sure why, what it adds to our argument is what I'm wondering.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I just kind of blow that one off because I don't think it adds anything to the things.
Yeah,
that
I'm
we
not sure it's
just
answering the
decide.
questions that we're asking.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so that's sons of God and daughters of men. My understanding, it's the godly line versus the ungodly line.
Yeah.
And I argue that from the context, and I argue for that from what they did wrong. Seems to be they just took from whomever they chose.
And that the punishment kind of fits
Yeah.
the crime in a way.
Okay, so that's at least my view. All right, conclusions. The Hebrew word Nephilim seems to mean one who falls on someone or is fallen.
Yeah.
And or falling ones, and I think that fits our context, meaning they're around at the same time as these other corrupt people are.
Yeah.
All right. People living 120 years seems to be until the flood, so that seems to make some sense there.
Yeah.
Sons of God, daughters of men, in context seems to be Sethites and Canaanites, and then the Nephilim were not said to be the offspring of the sons of God, but were around at that time, and I think that's actually really important.
Yeah.
So, does this make sense?
I think so,
So
yeah.
our Nephilim are giants. I don't have any problem with that. Even during David's time, there were Goliath and people like that. So they were tall.
Yeah.
And even Goliath said to be about 9 foot tall. That's pretty big.
Yeah.
And I've always thought that if you've got a lot of big people around and they're strong and tough, like even Goliath.
Yeah.
I can imagine him when I'm sure he could have been corrupt, but if he was, why would he work? Why he could just go beat people up and steal their stuff.
Right. It's kind of the oldest form of power in a way between men, I guess. It's like, there's no law supporting you or a state supporting you or a government necessarily. It's like whoever's the biggest is going to win in a fight. And so You know, even if I don't have to actually fight you, if I'm bigger than you, I can just take
Yeah.
because the threat is,
Yeah.
death or pain or whatever.
Sure. You know what thing I didn't talk about is that look what it says. Remember I read verse 7, and the Lord said, I will blot out.
This
man
is in
who-"
chapter 6.
Yeah,
Genesis
I'm sorry.
6. Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. And the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I've created from the face of the land. And from man to animals to creeping things to bird of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. Okay, it makes when I'm sorry for something, it's because something happens that I didn't know was going to happen, and so I'm sorry that it happens. When God can know things are going to happen, and still He can be sorry. Here's my example. When my kids were young, I told them, "Don't speed because you'll get." You'll get caught and then you have to pay this big fine and stuff. Now, I can still understand that that's going to happen.
Sure.
But when it actually happens and they actually have to pay a fine and it actually costs them a lot, I can still feel sorry for them in that they actually did what I told them were going to happen.
Yeah.
And I think that's like with God. God can tell us, mankind, not to do something.
Yeah.
But He knows we're going to do it, and He can still feel hurt when we do it.
Yeah.
So I think that's when He repents He's sorry that He made man. I think that makes perfect sense. He's sorry that mankind sinned like that, even though He knew it was going to happen. He can be sorry when they actually do it.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So I think it's showing us that God has emotions. He cares for us, and so He cares about His creation.
Yeah.
So I think it does make some sense.
Yeah.
And I don't think we have to argue that God didn't know this was going to happen.
Yeah.
Which is what some people have done.
Sure.
And I don't think you need
Right.
to.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
well, we just covered a lot of stuff.
That was a lot, but it's funny because when you started, that's what you kind of said. It was like, we're really not only talking about the Nephilim, because to talk about that, you kind of have to break out the other things that maybe are connected to it too strongly, and figure out what those things mean. And then that kind of leaves you space to figure out what Nephilim actually means.
Especially the sons of God and daughters of men. Do you see how that's related? If those were fallen angels, and if those were the offspring, the Nephilim were the offspring of them, then it's directly connected. Yeah. But I don't think that's the way it works.
Yeah.
So
that was very helpful.
Well, good. I hope. I'm not sure what we're covering the next time.
Yeah, I was about to ask you if you had any ideas. We can go as far as Abraham, but maybe there's something else.
I wonder if the flood would be worth talking about.
Yeah, that could be good.
The idea of universal versus local.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. That.
Yeah, maybe let's look at the flood.
Okay.
Let's look at the flood next week.
All right, let's do it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.